The morning sun painted golden streaks across Central Park as joggers traced their familiar paths and children's laughter echoed from the playground. It was one of those perfect New York mornings that made the city feel almost peaceful, where the usual chaos seemed to pause and breathe. The air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers, mixed with the earthy smell of dew-kissed grass. Birds chirped from ancient oak trees that had witnessed decades of human stories unfold beneath their branches. Among the early visitors was Eleanor Washington, a 73-year-old woman whose weathered hands told stories of a lifetime spent caring for others. She moved slowly along the gravel path, her worn sneakers crunching softly with each careful step. Eleanor had been coming to this park for 30 years, ever since her husband passed away. It was her sanctuary, her place of peace, where she could remember happier times and find moments of joy in simple pleasures. Today, like every Tuesday and Thursday, Eleanor carried a small paper bag filled with breadcrumbs. She had saved them from her breakfast toast, just as she had done countless times before. The pigeons knew her schedule better than most people knew their own. As she settled onto her favorite wooden bench near the old oak tree, they began gathering around her feet, cooing softly in anticipation. Eleanor smiled as she opened the bag and scattered the first handful of crumbs. The birds pecked eagerly at the ground, their iridescent feathers catching the morning light. This simple act of feeding the pigeons had become her daily meditation, a way to feel connected to something larger than herself. She had outlived her husband, most of her friends, and even one of her children. These birds, in their own way, had become her companions in solitude. The bench where she sat had a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of those who found peace here." Eleanor often wondered about the people who had chosen this spot before her, what stories they carried, what peace they sought. She understood that feeling deeply. After working as a nurse for 45 years, she had seen enough pain and suffering to last several lifetimes. This park, these birds, these quiet moments were her reward for a life spent healing others. As she scattered another handful of crumbs, Eleanor noticed the usual morning crowd beginning to fill the park. Young mothers pushing strollers, business people walking briskly with coffee cups in hand, elderly couples taking slow, careful walks together. Everyone seemed to have their place in this urban ecosystem. Eleanor felt invisible among them, which was exactly how she preferred it. At her age, she had earned the right to simply exist without explanation or justification. The pigeons cooed appreciatively as she continued feeding them, their small heads bobbing as they pecked at the crumbs. Eleanor spoke to them softly, as she often did, telling them about her plans for the day, about the book she was reading, about the weather forecast she had heard on the morning news. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like the harmless behavior of a lonely old woman. But to Eleanor, these conversations were vital. They kept her voice strong and her mind sharp. She had no idea that on this seemingly ordinary morning, her peaceful routine would be shattered by an encounter that would change everything. She could not have known that somewhere across the park, a man in a police uniform was beginning his shift with anger already boiling in his chest, looking for someone to take it out on. She could not have predicted that her simple act of feeding pigeons would be viewed as a crime worthy of humiliation and violence. As Eleanor continued her gentle ritual, completely absorbed in the peaceful moment, she remained blissfully unaware that her world was about to collide with forces far beyond her control. The morning sun continued to shine, the birds continued to sing, and life in the park continued its normal rhythm. But beneath the surface of this tranquil scene, darkness was approaching, carried by a man who had forgotten the true meaning of protection and service. The stage was set for an encounter that would test the very foundations of justice, courage, and human decency. Eleanor Washington, a woman who had spent her entire life caring for others, was about to discover whether anyone would care enough to protect her when she needed it most. Officer Marcus Kruger had been having a bad week, and he was determined to make someone else pay for it. His wife had filed for divorce, his supervisor had passed him over for promotion again, and his gambling debts were piling up faster than his paycheck could cover them. At 38 years old, he felt like his life was falling apart, and the only place where he still held any power was behind his badge and uniform. Walking through Central Park on his patrol, Kruger's eyes swept across the morning scene with the predatory gaze of a man looking for trouble. He had learned long ago that people feared the uniform, respected the authority it represented, and rarely questioned his actions. Over the years, he had grown addicted to that power, especially when exercising it over people who couldn't fight back. His gaze settled on Eleanor Washington sitting peacefully on her bench, feeding the pigeons. Something about her calm presence irritated him immediately. Maybe it was the way she seemed so content, so at peace with herself, while his own life was crumbling. Maybe it was simply because she was there, vulnerable and alone, presenting an easy target for his frustration. Or perhaps it was something darker, a prejudice that had been festering in his heart for years, waiting for moments like this to reveal itself. Kruger adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his badge against his chest, and began walking toward Eleanor with purposeful steps. His expression hardened into the cruel smile he wore when he had decided someone needed to be taught a lesson. The morning joggers and dog walkers instinctively moved out of his path, sensing the aggressive energy radiating from his imposing frame. "Well, well, well," Kruger announced loudly as he approached Eleanor's bench, his voice carrying the mocking tone of someone who enjoyed wielding power over others. "What do we have here? Feeding the rats with wings, are we?" Eleanor looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion into her peaceful morning. She saw the police officer standing before her, his face twisted into an expression of contempt that made her stomach tighten with fear. In all her years of coming to this park, she had never been bothered by anyone, least of all a police officer. "I'm sorry, officer," Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just feeding the birds. I didn't know I was doing anything wrong." Kruger laughed, but it was not a sound that contained any joy or humor. It was harsh and cutting, designed to humiliate. "Oh, you're sorry? That's what you people always say when you get caught, isn't it? Sorry doesn't fix the mess you're making, the disease you're spreading, the property you're damaging." Eleanor's eyes widened in confusion and fear. She looked around desperately, hoping someone might intervene or at least witness what was happening. But the other park visitors had begun to distance themselves, their eyes downcast, their steps quickening. The universal fear of confronting authority kept them moving, even as they sensed something terrible was unfolding. "Please, officer," Eleanor pleaded, her hands shaking as she tried to close the bag of breadcrumbs. "I'll leave right now. I won't come back. I promise." But Kruger was just getting started. The fear in her eyes only fueled his desire to assert his dominance. "Oh, no, no, no," he said, stepping closer to loom over her frail frame. "You don't get to just walk away. You've been coming here for weeks, months maybe, thinking you own this place, thinking you can do whatever you want because nobody's watching." The accusation was completely false, but truth had never been Kruger's concern. He was drunk on power and looking for a victim to abuse. Eleanor represented everything he had been taught to despise: vulnerability he could exploit, difference he could attack, innocence he could destroy. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Stand up right now." Eleanor struggled to her feet, her arthritis making the movement painful and slow. She clutched her bag of breadcrumbs to her chest like a shield, her eyes filled with tears of confusion and terror. She had lived through the civil rights era, had experienced discrimination and hatred before, but she thought those days were behind her. The realization that they were not, that evil could still wear a badge and uniform, was almost more than she could bear. Kruger circled her slowly, like a predator studying its prey. The few remaining onlookers kept their distance, their faces showing a mixture of horror and cowardice. They knew what they were witnessing was wrong, but the uniform intimidated them into silence. The badge on Kruger's chest seemed to give him license to do whatever he pleased. "You people think you're entitled to everything, don't you?" Kruger continued, his voice dripping with hatred. "Think you can just come into nice neighborhoods, make a mess, and nobody will say anything? Well, I'm saying something. I'm doing something about it." Eleanor's tears began to flow freely now, but she tried to maintain her dignity even in the face of this unprovoked attack. "I've never hurt anyone," she whispered. "I've never done anything wrong." "Haven't done anything wrong?" Kruger roared, loud enough for half the park to hear. "You're existing where you don't belong. That's what you're doing wrong. You're making decent people uncomfortable with your presence." The cruelty of his words hung in the air like poison. This was no longer about feeding pigeons or park regulations. This was about hate, pure and simple, wielded by a man who had been given authority but had never learned responsibility. Kruger was about to cross a line that would change everything, and somewhere across the park, a man in white was beginning to notice that something was terribly wrong. The verbal assault was just the beginning. Officer Kruger looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers, their faces frozen in a mixture of shock and helplessness. He fed off their fear, their inability to act, their silent acceptance of his authority. In their paralyzed expressions, he saw permission to escalate, to take his cruelty to the next level. "You know what your problem is?" Kruger snarled, stepping even closer to Eleanor until she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the veins bulging in his neck. "You don't know your place, but I'm going to teach you." Eleanor tried to back away, but the bench blocked her retreat. Her frail body trembled as she pressed herself against the wooden seat, clutching her paper bag of breadcrumbs like a lifeline. "Please, officer, I'll go home. I won't come back. Just please let me go." But mercy was not in Kruger's vocabulary. He had tasted power and found it intoxicating. The uniform he wore had become a costume for his hatred, the badge on his chest a license for violence. He looked at Eleanor and saw not a human being worthy of protection, but a target for his rage. "Oh, you'll go home all right," Kruger said with a twisted grin. "But first, you're going to learn what happens to people who don't show proper respect." Without warning, his hand shot out and grabbed Eleanor's frail arm with crushing force. She cried out in pain as his fingers dug into her aged skin, leaving marks that would last for weeks. The paper bag of breadcrumbs fell from her hands, scattering its contents across the gravel path. The pigeons scattered in a flurry of wings, abandoning the woman who had shown them such kindness. "Stop, please," Eleanor gasped, trying to pull away from his grip. But Kruger's strength was overwhelming. Years of physical training had built muscles that could easily overpower a 73-year-old woman who weighed barely 100 pounds. The crowd watched in horror, but still no one moved. Parents pulled their children closer and hurried past. Joggers slowed their pace but then sped up again, unwilling to get involved. Dog walkers tugged their pets in different directions, avoiding eye contact. Everyone could see what was happening, but the uniform intimidated them into inaction. Kruger reveled in their cowardice. "Look at that," he called out to the crowd, his voice echoing across the morning air. "Nobody's coming to help you. You know why? Because they know I'm right. They know you don't belong here." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of pain and humiliation. The physical grip on her arm was agonizing, but the emotional assault was even worse. She had lived 73 years with dignity, had raised children, worked as a nurse helping others, contributed to her community. Now she was being treated like garbage in front of dozens of strangers who were too scared to help her. "Please," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I'm someone's grandmother. I'm someone's mother. Please don't do this." But her pleas only seemed to anger Kruger further. "I don't care whose anything you are," he spat. "Right now you're nobody. You're nothing. And I'm going to make sure you remember that." His grip on her arm tightened, and Eleanor cried out again. She tried to remain standing, but her legs were shaking with fear and the pain was becoming unbearable. Kruger seemed to enjoy her suffering, feeding off her terror like a vampire feeding off blood. Then, in a moment that would haunt the witnesses forever, Kruger moved behind Eleanor and wrapped his thick forearm around her throat. The chokehold was swift and brutal, cutting off her air supply instantly. Eleanor's eyes went wide with panic as she realized she couldn't breathe. "No," she gasped, her hands clawing desperately at his arm. But it was like trying to move a steel beam. Kruger's forearm pressed against her windpipe with methodical precision, not quite enough to kill her immediately, but enough to cause excruciating pain and terror. The crowd gasped collectively, but still no one stepped forward. A young mother covered her child's eyes. An elderly man started to approach but was pulled back by his wife. A teenager took out his phone to record, but then hesitated, unsure if he should get involved. Kruger laughed as he felt Eleanor's body go limp in his grip. "This is what happens when you don't know your place," he announced to the crowd. "This is what order looks like." Eleanor's vision began to blur as oxygen deprivation took its toll. Her hands, which had spent decades healing others as a nurse, now fluttered helplessly against her attacker's uniform. She thought of her children, her grandchildren, the life she had lived with purpose and dignity. Was this really how it would end? Murdered in broad daylight by the very person sworn to protect her? As consciousness began to slip away, Eleanor's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone, anyone, would have the courage to help her. She didn't know that across the park, a figure in white was already moving in her direction, drawn by the commotion and the undeniable sense that something evil was unfolding under the morning sun. The chokehold tightened, Eleanor's struggles weakened, and the crowd remained frozen in place. Evil had revealed itself in the most public way possible, wearing the uniform of justice while practicing the art of cruelty. But sometimes, when darkness seems most overwhelming, light finds a way to break through. Jean-Claude Van Damme had come to the park for solitude and reflection. At 63 years old, the legendary martial artist and action star still maintained the discipline that had made him famous decades earlier. He wore a simple white GI with a black belt tied around his waist, the uniform he had worn since childhood when he first began studying karate in his native Belgium. The morning exercise in Central Park had become his ritual whenever he was in New York City. Away from the cameras, the interviews, and the constant attention of fame, he could simply be a man practicing his art in peace. The flowing movements of his kata, the controlled breathing, the connection between mind and body, these were the foundations that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. But as he moved through his routine near the park's eastern edge, a disturbance broke through his concentration. Voices carried on the morning air, not the pleasant sounds of children playing or couples talking, but something harsh and ugly. Years of training had sharpened his senses beyond those of ordinary men. He could distinguish between normal commotion and something dangerous. Van Damme paused in his movements, his body still as he listened. The sounds were coming from the direction of the old oak tree, where people often sat to feed the birds. He heard a man's voice, loud and aggressive, filled with the kind of hatred that made his blood run cold. Then he heard something else, the frightened whimpering of someone in distress. Without hesitation, he began moving toward the source of the commotion. His steps were silent despite his speed, a skill learned from decades of martial arts training. As he drew closer, the scene came into focus, and what he saw ignited a fire in his chest that he had not felt in years. A police officer, a man who should have been protecting people, had an elderly black woman in a chokehold. The woman's face was contorted with terror and pain, her hands clawing desperately at the arm crushing her throat. Around them, dozens of people watched in horror, but did nothing. They were frozen by fear, intimidated by the uniform, paralyzed by the authority the badge represented. Van Damme had seen injustice before. Growing up in Brussels, he had witnessed bullies pick on the weak. In his years in Hollywood, he had seen powerful people abuse their positions. But this was different. This was evil wearing the costume of justice, cruelty hiding behind the shield of law enforcement. Eleanor's body was going limp in Kruger's grip when Van Damme's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Let her go." The words were spoken calmly, without shouting, but they carried the authority of a man who had never backed down from a fight. Van Damme stood 30 feet away, his white GI bright in the morning sun, his stance relaxed but ready. His eyes were locked on the scene before him with laser focus. Kruger turned his head, annoyed at the interruption. He sized up the stranger quickly, compact build, obvious martial arts training, confident posture. But the officer was drunk on power and high on cruelty. He had crossed too many lines to back down now. "Move along, pal," Kruger called out, his arms still tight around Eleanor's throat. "Police business. Nothing to see here." Van Damme took 3 steps closer, his movements fluid and controlled. The crowd began to notice him now, whispers spreading through the onlookers. Some recognized the famous face, but others just saw a man finally willing to step forward when everyone else had remained silent. "I said let her go," Van Damme repeated, his voice carrying more steel this time. He could see that Eleanor was losing consciousness, her struggles growing weaker with each passing second. Time was running out. Kruger laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "Oh, we got ourselves a hero here, folks. What's that outfit supposed to be? Some kind of Halloween costume?" The mockery rolled off Van Damme like water off stone. He had faced ridicule before, had been underestimated by bigger, stronger opponents who thought his size meant he was weak. They had all learned the difference between size and strength, between muscle and power. "This is your last warning," Van Damme said, his body shifting almost imperceptibly into a fighting stance. To the untrained eye, he still looked relaxed, casual. But Eleanor, despite her fading consciousness, could sense the coiled energy in his frame, the barely contained force of a master preparing for battle. Kruger's grip tightened on Eleanor's throat, partly from defiance and partly from the first stirrings of uncertainty. There was something about the stranger's calm confidence that unsettled him. Most people wilted under his authority, backed down when faced with his badge and uniform. This man showed no fear, no hesitation. "You want a piece of this, old man?" Kruger snarled, but there was a slight tremor in his voice now. "I'll put you down right next to her." Van Damme said nothing more. Words had failed. The time for talking was over. He could see Eleanor's face turning blue, could hear her desperate gasps for air growing weaker. In seconds, it might be too late to save her. The legendary martial artist took one final step forward, his muscles coiling like springs, his mind calculating distance and timing with the precision of a master craftsman. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera began recording. History was about to be made in this quiet corner of Central Park, where an elderly woman's life hung in the balance, and a legend prepared to remind the world what justice really looked like. The morning sun caught the black belt around Van Damme's waist, and for just a moment, time seemed suspended. Then everything exploded into motion. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across the world, but for those witnessing it in person, it unfolded with the terrible beauty of justice finally unleashed. Van Damme moved with a fluid precision that had made him a legend, every motion calculated, every strike delivered with surgical accuracy. His first movement was deceptively simple. A swift step forward, a twist of his torso, and his hand clamped onto Kruger's wrist like a steel trap. The pressure point technique he applied was something he had learned decades ago, a method that could turn even the strongest grip into jelly within seconds. Kruger's chokehold on Eleanor collapsed instantly, as pain shot through his arm like lightning. Eleanor dropped to her knees, gasping and coughing as precious air rushed back into her lungs. Van Damme positioned himself protectively between her and the officer, his white GI fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. The transformation was remarkable. Seconds earlier, he had been a calm figure approaching the scene. Now he was a force of nature unleashed. Kruger staggered backward, clutching his wrist and staring in disbelief at the man who had just shattered his grip like it was made of glass. "You just assaulted a police officer," he roared, though his voice cracked with pain and shock. Van Damme's response was delivered in a tone as calm as still water. "I stopped an assault. There's a difference." The crowd had formed a loose circle around the confrontation now, phones held high, capturing every moment. Word was already spreading through the park. Jean-Claude Van Damme was here, and he was about to deliver the kind of justice that hadn't been seen outside of his movies. Kruger, his pride wounded more than his wrist, charged forward with the wild aggression of a man who had relied on intimidation his entire career. He threw a heavy right cross, the kind of punch that had cowed suspects and bullied innocent people for years. But Van Damme wasn't a scared civilian or an unarmed victim. He was a master martial artist with over 5 decades of training. The punch never landed. Van Damme slipped a blow with minimal movement, his head tilting just enough to let Kruger's fist whistle past his ear. In the same motion, he delivered a precise strike to Kruger's solar plexus, a technique that temporarily paralyzed the diaphragm and left the officer gasping for breath. Kruger doubled over, stunned by the speed and accuracy of the counterattack. He had expected resistance, but not this level of skill. Van Damme gave him no time to recover. A perfectly timed knee strike to the chest sent the officer sprawling backward onto the gravel path. The crowd gasped and cheered simultaneously. Children pointed in excitement, while their parents watched in amazement. This wasn't the choreographed violence of movies. This was real martial arts, applied with devastating effectiveness by one of its greatest practitioners. But Van Damme wasn't interested in prolonging the fight or showing off his skills. Eleanor was still on her knees, still struggling to breathe, and every second Kruger remained a threat was a second too long. As the officer struggled to his feet, face red with rage and humiliation, Van Damme decided to end it decisively. Kruger lunged forward one final time, abandoning any pretense of technique in favor of raw aggression. Van Damme met the charge with perfect timing, stepping into the attack and delivering his signature technique, a spinning heel kick that caught Kruger squarely on the jaw. The impact was thunderous. Kruger's head snapped back violently. His body lifted off the ground for a moment, then crashed onto the gravel path with a sickening thud. He lay motionless, unconscious, his badge glinting uselessly in the morning sun. Van Damme stood over the fallen officer for a moment, ensuring he wouldn't get up again, then immediately turned his attention to Eleanor. He knelt beside her, his expression soft with concern, his voice gentle as he spoke to her. "You're safe now," he said, offering his hand to help her to her feet. "He can't hurt you anymore." Eleanor looked up at him through tears of relief and gratitude, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you. I thought I was going to die." Van Damme helped her stand, supporting her weight as she regained her balance. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing across the park. People were calling out his name, thanking him, celebrating the moment justice had finally been served. But Van Damme's focus remained on Eleanor. He walked with her to a nearby bench, made sure she was comfortable, and stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. He answered the police detectives' questions calmly and thoroughly, providing his contact information and cooperating fully with their investigation. The videos of the confrontation went viral within hours. News outlets around the world picked up the story of how a legendary action star had stepped in to protect an innocent woman from a corrupt police officer. Legal experts analyzed the encounter, praising Van Damme's restraint and precision. He had used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop the threat. No more, no less. Officer Kruger was arrested and charged with assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his life forever changed by the choices he had made that morning. Eleanor recovered from her injuries and became an advocate for police reform, her story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. As for Van Damme, he quietly returned to his hotel, declining most interview requests and media appearances. He had not acted for fame or recognition, but because a human being needed help and he was in a position to provide it. In a world where too many people looked the other way when faced with injustice, he had chosen to step forward. The park returned to its normal rhythm within days, but the bench where Eleanor used to sit now bore a small memorial plaque, in honor of those who stand up for others when it matters most. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the light filters through the oak trees, just right, visitors say they can still sense the presence of justice in that peaceful corner of Central Park, where a legend reminded the world what courage really looks like.